Thank you. Mr. Rosenberger, last day of sitting, which was Friday, the 21st of January, you testified in respect to the fact that there are no rules that could govern the situation where stock size turned out mid-season to be less than escapement objectives. And I want to refer you to your testimony, and Mr. Lund will put this document and this transcript before you. It's now on the screen, and it's at page 15. And you said down at line 37, and I'd like to read it back to you and then ask for your understanding of your testimony. You said, in season, we identified a problem in the IFMP that we hadn't expected, and that was in the early summers and summers. We didn't have a rule that if we came back at less than escapement objective, what we would do, and we do have that for, in this case, for the early stewards, and it's a long established and discussed process. And for the lates, we had a rule, but not for those other two stock groupings. And that created considerable problems in that these fish co-migrate, and a number of First Nations in particular, and then you go on from there. I want to focus on that testimony for a moment. You say that you did not have a rule responding to in season a lower stock size than expected. And I assume that you also didn't have a rule for what to do in 2010 in season when a larger return occurred. Would you agree with me about that?
We didn't have any problems with the decisions or any of the rules, principles that were in the IFMP in 2010, except around making some adjustments on cultus.
But when you say you didn't have a rule for the situation as set out in your testimony there, don't you fall back on the Fisheries process? Doesn't that answer it? You rely on the Fisheries process when doing your pre-season analysis and drafting up your integrated harvest plan for that year. Why does not Fisheries give you the direction necessary? Why do you testify that you don't have a rule in circumstances such as that?
Well, in the case of the Fraser River Salmon Sockeye Spawning Initiative, the rules in that process are that below the lower cutoff point was to be no harvesting except for 2% for test fishing. So it states in there no harvesting, but that's the footnote as to how that will operate. In the case of the early stewards, we have a rule within the IFMP, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, on how to handle early stewards, in that we identified that we would protect up to 90% of the run. So we would use that rule from the IFMP, in this case, to how to implement what was going on in the Fisheries. So this is one of the places that we're actually looking to make changes in the Fisheries model, both to incorporate the change that we made in 2010 that we didn't have in place in 2009, that when these stocks come back at less than anticipated, and to allow for potentially incidental harvests or bycatch and other species fisheries, that we would target to protect up to 90% of the runs. So Fisheries doesn't give you that rule and what to do in that situation.
Now you say you do have a rule, though, in season when the stock is significantly higher than escapement, than your escapement targets. What is the rule that you rely on, as you did, for example, I assume in 2010, to deviate from the management plan?
We didn't deviate from the management plan. So in the overall harvest for the various stocks, and when they're in large abundance, the rules that you get out of the Fisheries model and that we were using in our fisheries is that you could have a total allowable mortality up to 60%. So that's 40% then of the stock would go to spawning ground.
Thank you. You also testified last day in respect to the over-escapement issue, and Ms. Baker directed your attention to testimony given by Mr. Lapointe on the over-escapement issue, and I want to focus on your evidence in that respect. And so we are still with the transcript of the 21st, which was last Friday. We are at page 26. And at line 8, Ms. Baker asks you questions and directs your attention to Mr. Lapointe's evidence. Then down at line 33, you say, well, productivity has been shown to decline at very high levels or even higher levels of escapement. So I think a key is being aware that if you want to have the highest recruits per spawner, you probably want to have a relatively low level of number of spawners. That's those given fish will give the best places to spawn and have the, best food to eat and whatnot. But there's a lot of inherent risk with that style of management, and that's not the management style that's adopted by the department. My question to you, sir, is this. What are the risks that you're speaking of when you speak of risks in that testimony?
What I was implying was if you have very low numbers of spawners, you have the risk that the returning fish might not find their partner in the given river system, and that's a concern in very low numbers in small populations. The predation that it could occur in some places from whatever the source might be if there's very few numbers of fish being produced in some of those areas. So the issues that we're striving for is a balance of ecosystem values as well as productivity from metrics such as just return per spawner.
Mr. Lapointe, in his testimony regarding some of these issues, said, and I'll read from his testimony, but I'm happy to put the transcript in front of you. This was of the 19th of January, last Wednesday. I'll give Mr. Lunn a moment to pull that up for us, and it's page 36 of Wednesday's transcript. I'm soliciting from you your comments of some risks with over-escapement as Mr. Lapointe testifies, and I'd like your response to it. I see it is now before us, and I'm referring to Mr. Lapointe's response at line 12 of the transcript where he says, no, I don't. He was asked regarding overescapement, and he says, no, I don't. And it isn't because I believe that the fish are wasted, and I think I had responded directly to that concept previously in my testimony. I believe there are impacts, and this is, and he's speaking of overescapement here. He says, and this is, don't think about salmon for a minute. Just think about general ecological knowledge. I know you have some biological training. He's responding to Mr. Leenham, I believe, in this exchange. And ask yourself whether any part of the ecological training that we have, and that I can speak on my part, would suggest that we shouldn't anticipate impacts on an ecosystem at the extremes. Okay? I'm talking about really, really low, say, abundance of fish or really, really high abundance of fish. I think we do anticipate that if we put a really, really large number of predators, which is what the sockeye are when they're in their lakes, the juveniles in that ecosystem, it's going to have an impact on that ecosystem. He goes on and he says, Quesnel sockeye is a perfect example. Quesnel sockeye impacts on that of this build-up of the Quesnel run have not just impacted the number of fish that came back in 2006. The kokanee population in Quesnel Lake has collapsed. The large trout population in Quesnel Lake has also been impacted. That ecosystem is fundamentally different, not better or worse, than it was before. Its capacity to produce the Fraser River sockeye may be different now. So what I'm trying to suggest to you, it's not about the benefits here, okay? It's not about the distribution of the surplus or whether there is a surplus. It's about the potential risks and consequences, not just to the folks that might want to catch some of these fish, but to the ecosystem at large. And to think that there is no risk, no consequence to the ecosystem of a very large escapement, I think is not consistent with all of our training. And now just let me read the last paragraph of his testimony. And in the case of Quesnel, we have very strong empirical evidence. So whether you're a bear in the Quesnel ecosystem that wants to eat those sockeye, or whether you're some other part of the ecosystem like the trees that might benefit from the nitrogen and the phosphorus that those carcasses deliver, extremes have a consequence to all parts of the ecosystem. So that's where I'm coming from. I'd like your response to his testimony. Do you subscribe to what he's saying?
I agree with him that the Quesnel escapement in 2002, 2003, which were very high levels for that time period, and in the Quesnel system over a longer time frame, caused changes in the ecosystem. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We have our freshwater science people found the fall fry to be at a very small size. We didn't get a large recruitment from them, and we found that the plankton community was very heavily, their terms in one meeting I was at, grazed upon by all these fry. So in that consequence, it definitely, I think, is an extreme and one that you want to avoid. The place where you're looking at whether that was too many fish, the discussion is that if you increase the populations at a slower rate, and in this case we came off some very low escapements in the previous years to those years, do you build up nutrients, which builds up the various levels of the food chain so that you can support higher numbers? That I think there's more to learn, and as if you review the data, you find that in most cases we have a lot of data points on the relatively lower ends of the spectrum of what we've seen in some Fraser populations, and fewer number of data points at the larger end. But we have seen when we make a large jump in the amount of spawners from previous years, especially in some of these cyclic dominant stocks, that we can have adverse impacts.
Thank you.
Just before you move on, I wonder if I could ask, I apologize for interrupting first of all.
Not at all, thank you.
The witness, in a response to an answer to you just a moment ago, used a term, and I wondered if you might not just explore it through your questioning, because it's on the point you've been making. I had heard, or I have heard evidence from other witnesses on this issue, using the term escapement objectives, and Mr. LaPointe in particular, but others as well. A moment or so ago in an answer to you, I apologize to Mr. Rosenberger. I don't have the transcript in front of me of what he just said, but I think he talked about attempting to balance, and I think he used the term ecosystem values and productivity. And I'm just wondering, not necessarily his opinion on this, but whether within the DFO we have some definition around escapement objectives and something he called ecosystem values. Are they the same thing? Or are we talking about different concepts? And you don't have to explore that, but I will if you won't. But I thought perhaps it falls more into your line of questioning.
No, I'd be very happy with the Commissioner's interjection at this point in time on that very issue. And I think you heard the Commissioner and his comments. Do you have response in terms of DFO's general approach to the definition of those issues?
Yeah, I think this is a key point that we're moving to in the wild salmon policy, in my view, and that historically, in my time in the department, most of our escapement objectives, the spawning ground objectives that we had, were largely based on maximum sustainable yield type of objectives. So trying to put the optimal number of fish on the spawning grounds to achieve the purpose of the maximum amount of harvest in future generations. And the wild salmon policy now is looking at broader objectives than just that maximum sustained yield side of things. We're trying to look at the amount of fish we need to think about for other parts of the ecosystem, whether that's predators in terminal areas or anywhere along the system, whether it's the impacts to killer whales in part of their habitats and needs. And so I think we're trying to understand better those broader ecosystem requirements, and that's built into the Strategy 3 and probably to somewhat 2 and 3 in the wild salmon policy. And so we're trying to build some of these benchmarks and trying to understand where we want to go. I think we're trying to move towards that understanding as opposed to just for the purposes of harvesting.
Before our break, and I was speaking about Ms. Stahlberg's evidence and the lack of habitat analysis, I'm informed by one of the Commission Council during the break that the term that I should have applied is habitat status report, and it's my understanding that Ms. Stahlberg's evidence was there had never been a habitat status report prepared. You generally understood what I was speaking about when I asked you those questions before the break? Even though I didn't use the term habitat status report.
Well, that's different to me from what you were describing earlier. So I am aware that we don't have a habitat status report. That's the objectives that we're trying to move to, again, in the wild salmon policy, and trying to bring together those indicators and understanding that status, that it is one of the areas that the department has been wanting to move on for a while, and trying to get a better status reports and indications of changes and trends in habitat status.
Right. Well, this unfortunately invites us a little bit back to this very subject matter, since you didn't, my misuse of the term. Appreciating that there is no habitat status report, as you acknowledge now, surely would you agree with me that that is regrettable that DFO has not as yet carried out such a status report when we hear so much about the threat to the ecology of the Cultus Lake sockeye?
Well, that's a part of, again, a key component of the wild salmon policy, and this is strategy 2, and that's trying to establish what are those parameters that we want to measure, how do we want to record this and collect the information. And so this is something the department is moving on and has some pilots, but I'm not at all involved in that process, other than trying to pick up information as I can.
I appreciate that, Mr. Rosenberger, and I appreciate that you're not the one responsible to make those calls, but surely the Cultus Lake issue has been with DFO for some time. It is a matter of focus as you read back from certainly the past decade, from 2000 to 2010. My question is, would not one have expected the DFO to have carried out a habitat status report on Cultus Lake by now?
Well, I don't believe we did habitat status reports before the wild salmon policy process started bringing this together, so I'm not certain we have them anywhere, but that's just my knowledge.
What about 2005 to now? Why hasn't it been done?
You'd have to ask the people in the habitat process. They are piloting this in some areas and getting methodologies together, but I'm not even certain where they're focusing.
Thank you.
Mr. Rosenblum, I wouldn't mind adding, here, I wouldn't mind adding to what Barry said on that specific point.
Yes.
And although the formal habitat status report has been entered into evidence as not being done, the Cultus Lake sockeye recovery team, and then later the conservation team, has looked at a number of habitat attributes related to Cultus sockeye in developing some of the strategies that might be used to help recover the population itself. So habitat considerations have been addressed to a certain extent in the work of the team.
But not comprehensively.
I'm not an expert on the habitat components of the recovery to speak whether it's the job that's been done is comprehensive or not. Sorry.
I want to draw your attention to the PPR, the policy review work that was filed in respect to harvest management, and I believe it is it's PPR number 5. And in that document, paragraph 161, I suppose Mr. Lund can put this forward. It'd probably be of assistance if you do have it on this screen. Paragraph 161, page 63 of the document. There it is. And I want to read this paragraph to you, and I want to ask you the current status of this situation. It reads, in April of 2008, DFO released a draft first revision of a policy document called A Framework for Socioeconomic Analysis to Inform Integrated Fisheries Management Planning and Fish Harvest Decisions. The framework presents guidelines and principles for conducting a socioeconomic analysis to inform the IFMP process and annual harvest decisions. The compilation of this framework was done in concert with Resource Management's development of a new template and guidelines for IFMP. According to this document, IFMPs are supposed to include an economic profile and an assessment of the current economic health viability of the fishery. An economic analysis of management objectives and measures will be done when the minister and/or senior managers make a request of resource management staff to look at particular options. My question is this. We learned from this policy report that as of April of 2008, DFO had a draft of this policy document on socioeconomic analysis. Is there been any development since 2008 in respect to completing that document, completing the drafts, and implementing a socioeconomic analysis document for policy purposes?
I can't answer your question specifically, but in terms of developing the integrated fishery management plan for salmon, we're moving over to be consistent with the template that's used nationally for development of IFMPs. In there is a specific section on the socioeconomic analysis of the resource. That hasn't been in our fishery management plans to date, but it's intended to be included with this year's, the 2011 integrated fishery management plan. The other point I was going to raise is that in some past decisions, for example, Cultus Lake sockeye, information to the extent that the department had it was provided on potential economic and social impacts of decisions, for example, associated with different exploitation rates.
But at this moment in time, to the best of your knowledge, you have nothing other than a draft document in respect to the guidance on socioeconomic analysis work. Is that correct?
I can't speak to whether this particular document's been finalized or not. In developing this section of the integrated fishery management plan, the salmon team, including myself, would be relying on our policy branch staff to develop that section of the IFMP for us.
Right. No one's finding fault with you in particular about it, but the fact is, if the document had been completed, finalized, signed off on, and was to be implemented, both of you would be fully aware of it because it would be utilized by you in decision making on harvest management, would it not?
Certainly the intention moving forward is to have that component in our integrated fishery management plans.
And the reason that it is intended to have that policy in place is because in making harvest management decisions day in and day out, both leading up to the development of the IFMP and for that matter in season, it is critical that the managers have a sense of the socioeconomic issues that are in play when decision making takes place. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's certainly an important component of the decision-making process.
And it is a component of the decision-making process that is currently absent from your process because you do not have that that direction and information to apply to your decisions. Is that not correct?
No, I don't think saying it's absent is an accurate depiction. We do have a variety of sources of information on the fisheries that we can we can use and have used in the past in making our decisions.
Well, this theme of mine in cross-examination will come out with later witnesses too. But I'm going to suggest to you, Mr. Grout, that when these decisions are being made by you, and obviously made with good intent on your part, but that you never have before you an analysis of precisely what will be the socioeconomic impacts to the commercial fishery when deciding option A as opposed to B or C. Do you agree with that?
As I've stated before, that's not an entirely accurate depiction. The department has endeavored to include that information in the past, and we have used outside contractors to provide us with some of that information where appropriate.
So are you suggesting that, for example, 2009, if one dug into your files, your archives, that one would find socioeconomic reports being done for the department in respect to the closure of the fishery?
No, I think you have a point. If you're trying to make the point that this information is provided for routine decisions that are part of the integrated, maybe you could further describe what you're trying to get at there.
No, I accept as you're going with it.
Okay, so, well, I guess the point I'd make is the department has used the information that it's had available to it in making decisions in the past. I'm not sure I fully understood your question regarding the 2009 fishery.
I'm just taking that as an example. Did you, as managers, have socioeconomic analysis done before decision-making in respect to the 2009 season when it came to, obviously, the Fraser sockeye?
If you're asking whether we had specific information linking to the potential socioeconomic impacts of a decision made in season to close the fishery in the pre-season period, we did not have that information that I'm aware of.
And it would be unsatisfactory to you that you had to make the decision in the absence of such socioeconomic analysis, isn't it? Or wasn't it?
Well, I think in that case, conservation continues to be the top priority in the management of the fishery, and that was the basis for the decision-making in 2009.
But don't we learn from the wild salmon policy, albeit it's not implemented yet, that the managers of the resource are to weigh conservation issues with socioeconomic issues? Isn't that part of the dictate of wild salmon policy?
That's correct. In terms of the management of the fishery and the development of the escapement plan and harvest rules for Fraser sockeye, that was one of the key components in the Fraser sockeye spawning initiative work that was done, looking at the specific balance of objectives to avoid low spawners and also avoiding low catch or providing for catch-related objectives.
Maybe I could add to that. The Early Stewart program and the rules around the Early Stewart is one that's had extensive discussion dating back to 1996 on trying to create some of those balances and weigh-off, and that's one of the reasons in that stock and in the early summers we were talking about earlier that we've moved to protecting 90% of the population as opposed to trying to protect 100%. So it's trying to weigh off some of those in this case more social and cultural kinds of issues than economic, but the same in the late run populations and utilizing a 20% maximum exploitation when some of the analysis through the Fisheries program indicates that there may or may not be an allowable, total allowable catch available. So it may not be explicit studies that are undertaken, but I think it forms part of the discussion and the debate, and also members in the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee and other committees we have in the Fraser panel bring those kinds of issues into the debate, where and how we should be having fisheries and the implications.
Yes, but the stakeholders who are bringing forward their position in these forums you speak of are obviously not generally economists and are not bringing to the table the kind of socioeconomic analysis that you would want as a framework for your decision making. Is that not fair to say?
Well, I agree with you. We do not have the more detailed analysis in most of these cases, and the trade-offs are not as explicit as they might be in Cultus and some of the other places where we've had more specific issues we've reviewed.
And that is a shortcoming to the current environment for you making the decisions that you're called upon to make, because you do not have available that socioeconomic analysis. Would you agree?
Yes, I think that's why we're making some of the changes that we're making.
Thank you. It was given by Mr. Lapointe on Tuesday last week, the 18th of January, and he was speaking of the fishery from Mission upriver and the concern, as he expresses it, of the mortality rate between Mission and to the spawning ground, and that mortality, as he theorized it, was partly because of all the gear that is found in the river, that there's been an increase in fishery from Mission upriver in recent time. And I want to just put his comments, and then I want to ask you, does DFO subscribe to his concern, and if they do, what are they doing about it? I refer you to page 86 of that day's transcript of last Tuesday. I refer you at line 37, where Mr. Lapointe, in response to Ms. Baker, said the following, line 37. Now, there's only one other point I want to make while I have this graph up that relates to the in-river fishing issue. And it's just one that I think is important to keep in mind. And the point is that you have had increased intensity of in-river fisheries since the 1990s, okay? It is not the catch part of that concerns me. It's the interaction with the gear in the context of warm water. So what I'm trying to say here is that if the fish are encountering gear more frequently because there's more gear in the water during these warm temperature years, that could exacerbate the mortality impact. In other words, an additional stressor on the fish have. So it's not about the poaching issue or any of that stuff. It's just about the gear fishery interaction and how that may be exacerbating by warm river temperatures that, is something I would flag as a potential concern. And that's all it is. Okay, it's just this potential gear impact. I think I should take the next paragraph too. We know from our work at Quallark, and understand that's a location where you have a hydroacoustics system, is that correct?
Yes, a DIDSON program.
Yes. A what program?
DIDSON.
Thank you. Or not, our work at Quallark, DFO's work at Quallark, and our work at Mission, that there's an impact on the fish distribution across the river when there are fisheries occurring. Fish tend to be moving offshore. A fish that's offshore is in the current. It's got to do more work to get to where it needs to go than the fish near shore. So it doesn't necessarily have to be physical, entanglement and escape. It could just be an effect on distribution. And where this goes in the future with climate change is something that we just have to keep a watch on. Now, I'm going to be asking you your comments on his testimony. Do you subscribe to it? And is DFO responding to it? But before doing so, I'm informed by my clients that the year 2009, when there was no fishery, that the mortality rate between Mission and spawning grounds was very, very low. Is that to your understanding too? In other words, where there was no fishery, Mission upriver in 2009, the mortality rate was very, very low. Do either of you have any information?
Well, I've seen this information. We reviewed it a lot. I'm trying to. It's a lot of data and a lot of years, so I don't have that specifically in front of me. Whether there was, what exactly our estimates of the mortality might have been, which is, and I assume from here you're referring to the difference between estimate of Mission to the spawning grounds.
Yes.
So I don't have that information coming to the top of mind.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. Going to Mr. Lapointe's evidence, do you subscribe to the concerns as he expresses them in that testimony?
Bit of context maybe. So yes, this is something that is becoming more of a concern, and it's largely it's the DIDSON monitoring program that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has run at Quaylark, and some of this we observed at the Siska Fish Wheel. So this is equipment that allows you to actually understand not just counting a ping as a fish is moving by, but you get to see the fish swimming by on the monitor. And so with the work of the gillnet that operates in conjunction with the DIDSON program, the hydroacoustics work portion, they're able to observe that the fish are, in some cases, avoiding the net as it drifts down through the area. So it's essentially, we've got some information that we didn't have before the last couple of years. So where we've been working on this and trying to understand it better is, and it's not just going on in British Columbia, many fisheries, in particular in Alaska, are looking at, most of our effort up until this point has been in what's called instantaneous release mortality, or the mortality of releases of fish in that first 24-hour period. That's how most of the studies have been designed. What we're trying to do now is work with UBC and Carleton University and others, trying to understand delayed release mortality impacts. And so we're working on a number of studies in cooperation with those two universities to understand some of these delayed impacts, some of the impacts of the gear, and we've done some of the work on trying to monitor from quailark in particular. On the impact and trying to think about how that plays out into the fisheries we've had now. In fact, I think you'd have to do some work to analyze whether, in fact, we've had more fisheries in recent times. There was considerable fishing in the early 1990s, but in many of the years, in the last 10 years, for example, we've probably had, in my view, we've had less fishing, less effort in the river system by people above mission than we did historically. So before the last 10 years, most of the time in the mission to Hell's Gate area, it was open 3 days a week, and some very large effort counts, in particular in the 80s and early 90s. Now we're more often fishing a day a week on most of those fisheries, or in some of the last few years closed. In the area of Lytton and Lillooet, further up, in the last few years, in most cases, we've had less fishing effort than we had 15, 20 years ago. And in some of the areas, the First Nations fishermen have actually banned the use of gill nets, utilizing dip nets only in places where, again, up until the mid-90s, they were open to gill net fishing. So I think that information would need to be looked at in a more systematic manner to understand some of these impacts.
All right, but not to make too fine of a point, Mr. Lapointe's concern that this may be an issue with mortality issues, and you have testified of the program that DFO is currently investigating these matters. Is that not correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Could I add to what Barry said? I had a couple different points than what Barry made, and the first is that in looking at the difference between estimates between mission and upstream areas, what we're looking at is essentially 5 components that can cause that difference between estimates. There can be biases in the mission hydroacoustic counts and on the spawning grounds. There could be biases in our catch estimates. There could be unreported catch that obviously we're not taking account of, or there can be actually mortality. So you've focused your questions a bit on the potential for mortality, but there are those 5 factors that contribute to the differences we see. And what we're using in the management process is simply a correlation between the sum of all those variables on the difference we see. And it happens that you get a correlation between environmental variables like river temperature or discharge. So I think that's an important point to make. I will say, in terms of your question, I was involved in some field research when I was working in the Lower Fraser office, and Barry referred to this Didson system. And for those of you that don't know it, it's akin to looking at an image of a baby in situ for a pregnant mother. So you've seen the ultrasound pictures on the fridge. You can actually get quite good quality images of fish migrating. The images are good enough to see the difference in size between, say, a Chinook and a sockeye. We set up this system at Yale in the Fraser River, and we were using it to look at not particularly fish passage, but the effect of the gill net that was fishing in this particular back eddy. So this was a set gill net in the Fraser River, and what we actually found, and this was just data from one day and 1 year, it's actually quite challenging to try and set these Didson systems up to actually watch a gill net while it's moving around in the current. But certainly in that year, I believe it was 2006, the water was quite low and clear. And what it showed when we went back and looked at the imagery from the video is that the gill net itself was probably catching 10% or less of the fish that appeared to be encountering the net. So in the imagery, you could see the fish coming towards the net, and I don't know if they were touching it. It appeared they were getting very close, and the image showed these fish veering off from the net. What we didn't know is whether that was causing a delay in the migration, and whether they were going out and around the end of the net, or whether they were just circling back around, and we were seeing the same school of fish delayed for the day. So there's certainly some observed evidence to support some of the things that Mike's talked about here in his evidence.
Thank you. I want to move very briefly. I just have 2 or 3 other areas of cross-examination. Over the last 15 years or so, there's been a pretty radical restriction in commercial harvest, and obviously 2010 is an exception. My question is, has that led to any problems at your end in terms of estimating run size? As I am educated by my clients, the commercial harvest, especially not so much early Stewart, but early summer and so on, you used to rely on catch information from the commercial fishery, partly to do ongoing management and estimates of the stock for that year. And you have been limited by the fact that there has obviously been a restriction on commercial harvest. Is that a fair comment to make?
If you're looking for the accuracy by having fish caught and having a fairly good idea that you've caught that fish, you know how many you're encountering on that side of things, versus the escapement side, which has the spawning ground counts, where we don't try to touch every fish. We're using either visual estimates or mark recaptures or fence counts, which would be more akin to actually, seeing and handling each fish. So that's where there's definitely uncertainty in the estimates. And when you have less of the fish caught, and back 20, 30 years ago, 60, 70, 80% of the fish were normally caught. So your confidence in the total number would be higher than it is in years when you have very little a portion of the fish caught, and a much higher portion of them are being estimated by other means.
Do you think that? Do you believe that your estimate procedures are hampered by the fact that where there is a restricted harvest, commercial harvest, you don't have that kind of data that you otherwise would have?
No, I don't think that impacts on the fishery.
Thank you.
Or the management moving forward.
When in 2010 with the IFMP, there was a decision made that there be a 20% harvest rate, target harvest rate for late runs. Can you tell me, was that the scientific community within DFO that made that decision? And if not, whose decision was it?
Well, just to clarify, so the IFMP that went out contemplated an exploitation objective for Cultus Lake sockeye ranging from 20 to 30%, depending on a couple of factors. One, the overall abundance, and then also the potential spawners that might reach the spawning areas. And so what it allowed is for potentially some flexibility in season to move from 20 up to 30% based on information that we had. We did also lay out that at the start of the season we'd contemplate starting at 20% until such time as we had more definitive information on the other factors I just mentioned, namely abundance and the potential number of spawners that would arrive in spawning areas.
So I'm sorry I listened to you, but maybe I didn't understand you. It was that the 20% benchmark, for want of a better term, that 20% figure that the scientists had promoted and it was adopted, or does it come from somewhere else? Who made the decision to impose in the IFMP for 2010 a 20% harvest rate?
Ultimately, the objective that's in the IFMP is signed off by the minister, and it was developed by the department based on feedback we had from our various groups during our consultation process. Science would have been involved in those discussions, but I don't know that I'd identify them as a proponent for one particular view.
But in 2010, the late run exploitation rate is not set at 20%. The Cultus exploitation rate is set at a starting place of 20%, and it may increase to 30%.
Sorry, are you suggesting late summers for 2010 on the IFMP did not set a 20% harvest rate target?
I don't believe that for 2010 that that's the objective that's stated in there.
Yeah, just to clarify, in my comments, I was referring to the constraint that would have been affecting the late run management from the cultus exploitation rate objective.
Are you?
The IFMP did. I don't believe we have a copy of that, Barry, in the evidence, but the late run the late run was described by a harvest rule, I believe.
Okay, well, I can't, I don't have the document either in front of me, so I'll leave that, and I thank you very much for your patience.
Well, I might be able, you may be, your question might have been referring to 2009 where there was a 20%. And that in some of the smaller late run years, that's how we've put it forward. And there has been some analysis done, and I believe it was in the 2008 year with the Fisheries process, where there's they look at late runs and trying to understand implications at various harvest rates if we wanted to take on that type of a rule. So that might be where you're looking.
Well, if it was 2009, is that figure driven by the scientists within DFO, or how does it come about?
Oh, that's what I was trying to describe, that in 2008 or 7, I'm looking for Jeff here, I don't know if he was a part of that process, but there was some science review of trying to understand the implication of exploitation rates at various levels for late run aggregate. And from some of that work, and then looking at some of the social economic side of things, is the, they picked a percentage off of that graph and in other considerations.
In terms of the science involvement in the work, I was involved in helping to put together a population viability analysis model, which was a tool to look at the probability of extinction or some very low number of spawners from which we thought the population might not recover, and recovery objectives that were laid out by the conservation team. And we were able to, essentially, it was a simulation model to look at the probabilities of the population recovering, given not just exploitation rates, but also the various other recovery objectives that were being, actions that were being contemplated, including removing predators in the lake and enhancement activities. Now that model went through the scientific review process, at the time it's called PSARC, that would have been the scientific approval of the model that was used.
Thank you very much. I thank you for your patience.
Mr. Commissioner, the next council is Council for Southern Area Eagle Netters and BC Fisheries Survival Coalition.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Anila Srivastava, and the spelling again is Srivastava, first initial A for BC Fisheries Survival Coalition, Southern Area Eagle Netters. Gentlemen, I'm actually going to, because we're so close to the lunch break, I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions that Mr. Rosenblum asked you, because I think there might be just 2 or 3 short questions that we can manage before the lunch break. And I think this question is probably more directed to Mr. Grout, but obviously Mr. Rosenberger, if you wish to contribute, could be very helpful. Mr. Lapointe, I asked Mr. Lapointe quite a few questions about the difference between estimates, and you, Mr. Grout, had just responded to Mr. Rosenblum's question. One of the 5 factors you identified, you stated, I believe, that the environmental factors are the most highly correlative. Is that right? Is that what you told us?
I don't recall my exact words at this point, but of those 5 factors that contribute to differences between estimates, I was indicating that we can often find correlations with environmental variables that it can explain some of the variation across years in those differences.
Thank you. And just to be fair, I'm not trying to spring surprises on you at all. Mr. Lapointe had said the same thing, and he had a very nice graphic presentation that showed correlations between high difference between estimate years and years in which there was an identifiable high temperature event or high water flow event. So if I understand correctly, you're saying that you agree with that assessment, that that is one of the strongest factors affecting difference between estimates. Am I right?
Not having seen his presentation, if you're asking me whether high discharge or high water flows and high temperatures have strong correlations for some of the management aggregates, then my answer would be yes.
If that's the case, would it be possible scientifically, and the second part of the question is, would it be helpful scientifically to extract the environmental factor, temperature and water flow, and show those indicators as separate factors contributing to the DBE and therefore to difference in management assessments?
That question might be better posed to one of the PSC staff or a member of the Fraser Panel Tech Committee. I believe that those are things that they have looked at in the past, i.e. combinations of temperature and other variables, or those variables on their own, to try and find what has the most explanatory power.
And explanatory power is a term that did come up in Mr. Lapointe's testimony, probably because I used it. What I'm getting at fundamentally is that the management adjustment can often be a very large figure from year to year. In setting the actual IFMP, the overall management plan, and then adjusting the rules in season, as a scientist and someone who's designing a management plan, is it not difficult to accommodate in management an adjustment figure that can be as much as 50% or more of the run?
I'm not entirely sure that I follow your question, but in terms of the management plan we put together, we do contemplate potential for management adjustments and layout in the escapement plan, how those would be accounted for in determining the total allowable catch.
Fair enough. Let me come in at another way then. As a manager, would it not be, as someone who's contributing to fisheries management plan, would it not be helpful to separate out factors that are within human control and specifically within DFO control, as opposed to factors that are environmental and outside of DFO's control? And what I'm getting at is in river fisheries. Would it not be possible and helpful to separate out all aspects related to that interior fishery above the Mission Bridge, and again, indicate that as a separate variable and set of factors for assessment, rather than lumping it all into a management assessment figure that also includes completely disparate factors like environmental factors?
I'm not sure I can specifically comment on your question.
I mean, if I could add, I think any time that you could separate out these 4 or 5 items that Jeff had described earlier, and have a good correlation with them, so you can make decisions around them in season and try to affect some of them, obviously that would improve the system.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenberger. I'm struggling also a little, Mr. Rosenberger, with this whole issue of productivity declines at very high levels of escapement, and Mr. Rosenblum had gone over that testimony with you again. And some earlier testimony of yours, Mr. Grout, when you described that the changes to the 2010 model can provide several different scenarios based on different productivity assumptions. And one of the things I'm wondering is if DFO's management, which it seemed to me you were saying, Mr. Rosenberger, did not endorse a high-risk approach to productivity and escapement. How does that affect using productivity itself as a variable in the model? In other words, isn't DFO's management philosophy, which it seemed that you were saying, Mr. Rosenberger, was a lower risk philosophy with respect to productivity, does that in itself not affect the future cycles?
Your terminology is probably
And I'm sorry, that's probably my fault, because I am really struggling with understanding how it is that productivity can be both a variable that's used in the management model, and how an approach to productivity that's low risk, as I understand it from your testimony today, doesn't affect that variable in itself.
Yeah, well, I'm not a modeler, so how they've put that into the model and using it for forecasting you're probably going to get one of the later witnesses will be able to describe some of that better. So I think that's probably the best we could do. I think on using the term that we're, the way you were describing it, it might be different than what I was trying to describe when it was asked that if you were striving for the highest rate of return of spawners, then we generally get a higher rate of return on lower levels of spawn. And what we described in some of this discussions and places has been looking at things like maximum sustainable yield. So when you're doing that and you have a large volume of data, which is one of the reasons we use 19 populations where we have more information than all 30 some that might be CUs, is around trying to look for those relationships. And when you're looking at maximum sustained yield, is you're trying to find the place on that curve where it's starting to bend down towards a lower productivity, and that was the historical optimal escapement that many stocks were striving for.
Thank you. And so, Mr. Grout, and the shift that you described last week is that the change in the 2010 model is that you can plug in different or even floating, so productivity in different years going up and down, and that you can then come up with several different scenarios based on different productivity assumptions over that time series. Is that right?
Yeah, so in the Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative model itself, we're looking at the spawning and recruitment data for each population in the model. From that data, you can estimate what the productivity of that population might be. That productivity reflects the historical data. There's some uncertainty around that estimate given the scatter in the data that we've seen historically. So the model's accounting for the uncertainty in the historical data. One of the concerns we've heard is that going forward, due to global warming or habitat degradation or some other factor, the productivity may be permanently impaired. And to try and address that in some of our modeling work, there were some scenarios, I believe they're in the 2010 memo with the escapement Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative memo. We looked at some scenarios of productivity based on the historical data, and then some reductions in productivity for the whole forward simulation. I know one of the scenarios was a reduction by half. So you can look at what effect, without knowing what the future holds, you can essentially look at, okay, if it is this, what effect might that have on the performance of the particular harvest rule you're intending to use? So it's a more recent addition to the model, trying to address some of the concerns that have been raised about what future productivity might be.
And so if productivity may be permanently affected by environmental factors, but what I'm trying to get at, Mr. Grout, is it not also possible that productivity can be impaired by a set of rules in one particular year that generate massively high levels of escapement, say 90%, like we were talking about for 2009? Is it not possible that the management decision itself could decrease productivity in the 4 years, 8 years, 12 years following that cycle, not just environmental factors that you are trying to put into the mix?
This would be a good question to repeat to the Fraser Sockeye Spawning Initiative folks when they come and talk to the committee, but my understanding of some of the sensitivity analysis work that was done here is that the actual choice of the population dynamics model is more important than the choice of a harvest rule in any given year. And what I mean by that is whether you choose to use a Ricker style model, which describes the productivity parameter in the data and doesn't contemplate any density effects across years, versus a Larkin model, which would allow for potential effects of 1 year's abundance on subsequent years. So in the modeling work that's been done, it's my understanding that the choice of that particular model is actually quite important.
Good. That's helpful. It certainly clarifies my mind. It'll help me in talking to that panel. Mr. Commissioner, those were those two sort of questions that arose from Mr. Rosenblum's cross, and perhaps now would be a time to break.
Yes, thank you. Before we break, I'm advised that there is in the public audience today a number of university students who are, I believe, embarking potentially upon a career in the field of the science that we are engaged in examining. And I would expect that this morning's evidence will either inspire them to carry on in their program or perhaps have them go home this afternoon and change their career plan. In any event, they're welcome here today, and I'm delighted that they're taking all of this in. Perhaps they can tell us later if they understood anything we were talking about this morning. Thank you very much. We'll break now until 2 p.m.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.